My daughter snatched my leather folio right out of my hands at dinner and said loudly enough for the entire restaurant to hear that I did not need it anymore because my mind was slipping. I simply stared at her, left $100 bill on the table, and walked out into the freezing night. The very next morning, I closed the bank account that funded her entire lifestyle. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an entitled family member a lesson they will never forget. The air inside the dining room of the Wellington was thick with the scent of roasted garlic, expensive perfume, and old money. It was exactly 1 year since my wife Diane had passed away. I chose this restaurant because it was her favorite. She used to love sitting by the tall windows, watching the city lights blur into golden streaks against the glass. I sat at the head of the heavy mahogany table, staring at the empty chair to my right. I was 70 years old, a retired forensic accountant who had spent 4 decades dismantling corporate fraud. But tonight, I was just a man missing his wife. Across from me sat my daughter Vanessa. She was 38, dressed in a designer silk blouse that I had indirectly paid for, tapping furiously on her newest smartphone. She had not mentioned her mother once since the appetizers arrived. Instead, she complained about the valet parking, the temperature of the soup, and the slow service. Sitting next to her was her husband Bradley. He was a man who wore suits that were slightly too tight and spoke a little too loudly. He ran what he called a logistics startup. It was a business I knew was bleeding cash, mostly because I had discreetly reviewed his public tax filings out of paternal concern. I sat quietly cutting my steak, listening to Bradley boast about a phantom contract he was supposedly negotiating. He swirled his glass of heavy red wine, leaning back in his chair with unearned confidence. He talked about profit margins and supply chains using buzzwords that meant absolutely nothing. My forensic mind automatically calculated the impossibility of his claims based on current diesel costs and warehouse overhead, but I said nothing. I let him talk. Diane always told me to be gentle with them, to remember that Vanessa was our only child, and that Bradley, despite his immense flaws, was the man she chose. But Diane was gone, and the fragile peace she had maintained was rapidly beginning to crack. The tension at the table was not born of grief. It was born of impatience. Vanessa kept glancing at my watch, then at my face, her eyes narrowing with a calculating coldness that made my stomach turn. She was not looking at a grieving father. She was looking at an obstacle. Over the past 3 months, she had been dropping aggressive hints about my age. She would ask if I remembered taking my vitamins, or she would deliberately rearrange items in my kitchen and then feign deep concern when I could not find them. It was a slow, deliberate campaign to paint me as incompetent, but I had spent my entire career tracking liars. I knew exactly what she was doing. The waiter, a polite young man in a crisp white shirt, approached our table and gently placed the leather-bound checkbook in front of me. The bill was substantial, a reflection of the 3 bottles of vintage wine Bradley and Vanessa had consumed. I reached into the breast pocket of my wool suit and pulled out my worn leather folio. It was not just a wallet. It held my premium credit cards, my checkbook, the master keys to my safe deposit boxes, and the access codes to my primary trusts. As my fingers touched the zipper of the folio, Vanessa moved. She lunged across the table with startling speed, her manicured fingers digging into the worn leather. She yanked the folio forcefully out of my grip. The sudden movement knocked over a half-empty water glass. Ice cubes spilled across the pristine white tablecloth, soaking into the linen. The clinking of silverware from the surrounding tables stopped. People turned to look. I did not reach back for it. I froze, looking at my daughter's face. She was not embarrassed. She was triumphant. "Dad, let me handle this from now on," Vanessa said. Her voice was artificially loud, designed to carry across the quiet dining room. She projected the tone of a deeply burdened, sympathetic caregiver, but her eyes were entirely dead. "You have been so confused lately. You forgot to call me back on Tuesday. You left the porch light on twice this week. It is simply not safe for you to manage the finances anymore. Your mind is slipping, Dad. It is time we take over for your own good." A woman at the next table gasped softly, looking at me with overwhelming pity. The waiter stood frozen, unsure of what to do, his eyes darting between me and Vanessa. Bradley leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, offering a condescending smile. "It is for the best, Calvin. We hate seeing you struggle like this. Let us manage the heavy lifting. You just relax at your age. Go play golf. We have got the accounts covered." Vanessa unzipped the folio right there in front of the audience she had captured. She pulled out my black titanium card, holding it between two fingers like a trophy, and handed it to the waiter. "Charge it to this," she ordered, her voice dripping with newfound authority. "And bring me a receipt to sign. I am his power of attorney." It was a lie. She was not my power of attorney, but the waiter did not know that. He took the card nervously and hurried away toward the register. I sat perfectly still. The silence in my head was absolute. I did not feel confusion. I did not feel the helpless panic of an old man losing his grip on reality. I felt the icy, familiar calm of a forensic investigator who had just watched a suspect willingly walk into an interrogation room and confess. I looked at the daughter I had raised, the woman whose college tuition I had paid in cash, whose mortgage down payment I had quietly funded, whose extravagant lifestyle I had subsidized for a decade to keep her happy. She had just publicly humiliated me, attempting to strip me of my dignity and my autonomy in a room full of strangers, all to gain unrestricted access to my capital. She assumed my silence was submission. She assumed my grief over Diane had made me weak. She had made the fatal miscalculation, one of confusing a quiet demeanor with a broken mind. I stood up from the table. The wooden chair scraped loudly against the polished floor. I did not shout. I did not demand my folio back. I did not offer a single word of defense against her vicious accusations. Defending my sanity to an audience of strangers would only make me look like the confused old man she claimed I was. I reached into my left trouser pocket and pulled out a crisp, folded $100 bill. I placed it gently on the dry corner of the tablecloth. "That is for the waiter," I said. My voice was low, steady, and entirely void of emotion. Vanessa frowned, clutching my folio tightly to her chest, as if I might try to snatch it back. "Where are you going, Dad?" "Sit down. We need to discuss the house next." I did not answer her. I turned my back on my daughter and my son-in-law. I walked away from the table, my spine perfectly straight, my steps measured and even. I felt the eyes of the entire restaurant burning into my back, but I did not falter. I walked out the heavy glass doors of the restaurant and stepped onto the sidewalk. The winter air hit my face like a physical blow. It was freezing, the kind of cold that clears your lungs and sharpens every sense. The valet rushed over, asking if I needed my car brought around, but I shook my head. I needed to walk. I needed the rhythm of my own footsteps to match the rapid, precise calculations forming in my mind. Vanessa had my folio. She had the physical cards, the paper checks, the surface-level tools of my wealth. But she did not understand the architecture of my money. She did not know that I had built firewalls within firewalls, fail-safes, that I had designed to protect Diane in case anything ever happened to me. Vanessa thought she had stolen the keys to the kingdom, but all she had done was trigger the security system. I walked for 3 miles through the dark city streets. The grief that had weighed me down for 12 months began to evaporate, replaced by a cold, protective fury. They wanted control. They wanted to dismantle my life to fund their failures. They had used Diane's memory as a backdrop for a robbery. By the time I reached my empty house, I did not turn on the lights. I sat in the darkness of my study, watching the digital clock on my desk tick away the hours. I did not sleep. I waited. At exactly 6 in the morning, the sky began to turn a bruised, pale gray. I stood up, put on a fresh suit, and drove downtown. I stood alone on the freezing granite steps of the First National Bank. The heavy bronze doors were locked, but I could see the security guards inside sipping their coffee, turning on the lobby lights. I checked my watch. It was 6:55. I had 5 minutes until the doors opened. 5 minutes until my daughter realized she had not disarmed a frail old man, but had instead awakened a predator. I stood in the cold, feeling the chill seep through the soles of my shoes, completely ready to tear their world apart. The heavy glass doors of the First National Bank unlocked at exactly 7 in the morning. I walked into the grand lobby, my leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. The air inside smelled of expensive wax and freshly brewed coffee. I had been a private wealth client at this institution for more than 3 decades. The security guards knew my face. The tellers knew my routine. They knew me as the quiet widower who came in on Tuesday mornings to check his safety deposit box. But today, I was not here for a routine visit. Today, I walked straight past the velvet ropes of the teller line and approached the frosted glass office of the senior branch manager. His name was Matthew. He was a sharp professional who had handled my accounts for years. Matthew stepped out of his office before I even reached the door, looking visibly pale and deeply relieved to see me. Matthew ushered me into his office and firmly closed the heavy oak door behind us, shutting out the ambient noise of the bank lobby. He gestured nervously to the leather armchair across from his massive mahogany desk. He did not offer me coffee or make polite conversation about the winter weather. He sat down heavily in his own chair and pulled a thick manila folder from his top drawer. I sat perfectly still, resting my hands comfortably on my knees. I did not ask him what was wrong. In my 40 years of working as a forensic accountant, I had learned that absolute silence makes people rush to fill the void, and when they rush, they give you exactly the information you need. "Calvin, I am so incredibly glad you are here," Matthew said, his voice tight with an underlying stress that he could not hide. "We flagged a highly irregular and massive transaction on your primary liquid checking account at 4 o'clock this morning." I kept my face entirely neutral. I did not gasp or clutch my chest. I simply looked him in the eye and asked him to explain the exact nature of the anomaly. Matthew opened the manila folder with trembling fingers and pushed a printed page across the polished wood of his desk. An online wire transfer request was initiated from an IP address registered to your daughter Vanessa. She attempted to move exactly $80,000 from your liquid savings directly into a commercial business account registered to a logistics company. I looked at the paper resting in front of me. The logistics company belonged to Bradley. The audacity of the number did not shock me at all. $80,000 was precisely the amount Bradley needed to cover the defaulting commercial loans on his failing startup. I knew this because I had quietly run a background audit on his public business filings 3 weeks ago. What truly intrigued me was not the theft itself, but the mechanism of the theft. I looked at Matthew and asked him how Vanessa had managed to bypass the strict secondary security protocols I had personally placed on all of my financial accounts. Matthew swallowed hard and pushed a second, much thicker document across the desk. She bypassed the security alerts by uploading a digitally notarized durable power of attorney, he explained, tapping his pen against the paper. "The document legally claims that you are experiencing severe cognitive decline, that you are no longer fit to manage your own assets, and that Vanessa has been granted full and immediate financial conservatorship over your entire estate." I picked up the printed document. The paper felt heavy and cold in my hands. This was no longer a simple family dispute over a dinner bill at a restaurant. This was a calculated, premeditated federal crime. It was a Class 2 felony. I had spent my entire professional life hunting down corporate embezzlers, corrupt executives, and master forgers. I had testified in federal court against men who stole millions using incredibly sophisticated offshore shell companies. I knew what real financial crime looked like. Now I was looking at a clumsy, desperate forgery executed by my own flesh and blood. I scanned the document with the highly trained eye of a senior auditor. I saw the glaring inconsistencies almost immediately. The notary stamp impressed at the bottom of the page was registered in a completely different county, one that Vanessa had not visited in years. The date of execution was listed as a Sunday, a day when state legal offices and licensed notaries were strictly closed. The signature at the bottom, supposedly my own, was a pixelated digital copy lifted directly from an old joint tax return I had filed 5 years ago. It was a sloppy and arrogant attempt at fraud built entirely on the assumption that the bank would not question a daughter trying to protect her supposedly senile father. I felt a cold and hard knot form deep in my chest. My late wife, Diane, had spent her entire life making constant excuses for Vanessa. Diane used to tell me that our daughter was just finding her way in the world, that she needed more time to mature, and that her selfishness was just a phase. I sat in the silent office and wondered what Diane would say if she were sitting next to me right now, looking at a forged legal document designed to strip her husband of his autonomy and his life savings. Vanessa did not just want my money to buy designer clothes or expensive vacations. She wanted to erase my independence. She was perfectly willing to commit federal wire fraud to fund her husband's disastrous business ventures, relying entirely on the cruel assumption that I was too old, too weak, and too confused to notice the money disappearing. Matthew watched my face closely, waiting for an emotional reaction. He clearly expected an old man to break down in tears of heartbreak. He expected confusion or denial. Instead, I handed the fraudulent papers back to him with a perfectly steady hand. Did the wire transfer clear the holding account? I asked, keeping my tone strictly professional. Matthew shook his head in relief. No, Calvin, he said. The automated fraud department caught the geographical anomaly on the notary stamp and placed a temporary 24-hour hold on the funds. But the hold expires at midnight tonight. We desperately needed your physical verification to permanently block the transfer and report the fraudulent document to the authorities. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the edge of his desk. I did not just want to block the transfer. I wanted to build an impenetrable wall of concrete around my entire financial existence. Matthew, I said calmly, I need you to execute a complete and total lockdown protocol on my profile. I want every single account linked to my social security number frozen immediately. Cancel all active credit cards, including the black titanium card Vanessa physically stole from me last night. Revoke all authorized user privileges across every platform. I want my safety deposit boxes sealed and flagged. Any future transactions, withdrawals, or transfers must require my physical presence in this exact office, 2 forms of government identification, and a biometric fingerprint scan. Matthew stared at me for a moment, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock and deep professional respect. He did not ask any questions. He turned to his computer monitor and began typing furiously on his keyboard. I sat in the quiet office and listened to the sharp clicking of the keys, knowing that each keystroke was a nail in the coffin of my daughter's entitlement. Matthew hit the enter key with a definitive strike, and I watched the reflection of his computer screen flash red against his glasses. It is officially done, Calvin, he said, letting out a long breath. Your assets are now entirely inaccessible to anyone on Earth but you. The forged power of attorney has been flagged in our national database, and any further attempts to use it will immediately trigger an automatic police dispatch to the perpetrator's location. I thanked him politely, stood up from the leather chair, and buttoned my suit jacket. Vanessa truly thought she was playing a simple game of checkers. She thought she could sneak behind my back and steal a few pieces off the board while I was blinded by grief. She had absolutely no idea that she had just sat down at a grandmaster chessboard with a man who engineered financial traps for a living. I walked out of the branch manager's office, past the security guards in the lobby, and stepped back out into the bright morning sun. The financial lockdown was complete. The trap was perfectly set. Now all I had to do was wait for Bradley to try and swipe his corporate credit card at his crucial morning vendor meeting, completely unaware that the ground beneath his feet had just vanished. Matthew left me alone in his office for a few minutes to process the final signature verifications. I sat in the quiet room and looked at the stack of confirmation receipts printing out on his desk. Each piece of paper represented a wall being built around my life. To the average person, money is just currency. It is a tool used to buy groceries or pay the mortgage. But to me, money has always been a language. For 40 years, I worked as a senior forensic accountant for a federal task force. My job was not to balance checkbooks. My job was to track the invisible footprints left behind by very smart people who thought they were entirely untouchable. I spent decades sitting in windowless rooms dissecting the complex offshore shell companies of corrupt corporate executives. I hunted embezzlement rings that hid millions of dollars behind layers of fake vendors and shadow accounts. I learned very early in my career that liars always leave a trail. They get arrogant, they get greedy, and eventually they make a careless mistake. Vanessa grew up in a beautiful suburban home entirely shielded from the reality of my profession. She thought I was just a boring man who stared at spreadsheets all day. She never saw the federal grand jury subpoenas I drafted. She never saw the powerful men who wept in interrogation rooms when I presented them with the exact mathematical proof of their crimes. She only saw a father who bought her ponies and paid for her expensive private school tuition. She assumed my quiet nature was a symptom of weakness. She assumed that because I was 70 years old and grieving the loss of my wife, I had lost my edge. She did not realize that grief had only stripped away my patience, leaving behind the cold, analytical machine that had built our family fortune from nothing. When she slid that forged power of attorney across the bank counter, she thought she was stealing from an oblivious old man. She had absolutely no idea she had just walked straight into the arena of a master investigator. I did not just freeze the primary checking account. I initiated a scorched earth protocol. I opened my secure digital portfolio on the bank terminal and began severing every single financial artery connected to my daughter and her husband. First, I targeted the auxiliary credit lines. For the past 5 years, I had quietly maintained a revolving corporate credit account under my name that Bradley used to cover the daily operating expenses of his logistics business. He used it to pay for his commercial fuel, his warehouse supplies, and his expensive client dinners. I logged into the portal and permanently revoked his authorized user status. I watched the green active light on the screen turn to a solid locked red. In that single keystroke, I completely severed his business from its life support system. Next, I moved to the family trust. I had originally structured the trust to distribute a generous quarterly dividend to Vanessa. It was meant to ensure she never had to worry about medical bills or emergency expenses. I contacted my private wealth manager on the secure line and invoked a dormant penalty clause I had written into the original charter. The clause instantly suspended all distributions pending a comprehensive financial review. I worked with the exact same ruthless efficiency I used when dismantling organized financial syndicates. I did not feel angry. Anger is a messy emotion that clouds judgment and leads to mistakes. I felt an absolute crystal-clear sense of purpose. Every time I closed an account, I imagined the invisible threads connecting me to their toxic entitlement snapping one by one. I was erasing my financial footprint from their lives completely. They had wanted the burden of managing my money. Now they were going to experience the crushing weight of managing their own. I thought about Bradley sitting in his rented office right now wearing his tight suit pretending to be a successful entrepreneur. He built his entire identity on the illusion of wealth, but that wealth was just a shadow cast by my money. I knew his exact schedule. I knew that at 10 o'clock this morning, he was hosting a critical meeting with his primary freight vendors. He would take them to an expensive breakfast. He would try to impress them with grand promises and order the most expensive items on the menu. He would reach into his pocket and pull out the shiny corporate card I had paid the bill for every single month. I signed the final piece of paper on the desk. The physical act of signing my name felt like closing a heavy vault door. I stood up and buttoned my coat. The silence in the bank felt different now. It was no longer the silence of an old man hiding from the world. It was the silence of a hunter who had just laid the perfect trap in the woods. I walked out of the bank and stepped into the crisp morning air, feeling lighter than I had in a year. The trap was set, and the fuse was lit. It was only a matter of time before the explosion. I got into my car and drove away, knowing that somewhere across town, a waiter was about to hand Bradley a declined credit card, and the entire facade of his arrogant life was about to shatter into a million irreparable pieces. I did not need to be sitting in the private dining room of the Oak Steakhouse to know exactly how Bradley's morning was unraveling. I had seen him perform this specific routine a dozen times before. At exactly 10 in the morning, he was hosting 2 senior executives from the largest freight shipping company on the East Coast. These were hard men who had built their fleets from a single truck. They wore off-the-rack suits and possessed a ruthless instinct for detecting weakness. Bradley, on the other hand, arrived wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit that I had indirectly paid for. He wore a heavy gold watch that he bought with the Christmas bonus I gave him 2 years ago. He sat at the head of the heavy oak table, projecting the false image of a brilliant logistics visionary. He ordered the most expensive items on the menu to establish dominance. He told the waiter to bring them dry, aged ribeyes and 3 bottles of imported sparkling water. He spent the entire first hour of the meeting leaning back in his leather chair, waving his hands and throwing out empty corporate buzzwords. He promised the freight executives massive volume contracts and guaranteed nationwide distribution networks. He painted a picture of a rapidly expanding startup backed by limitless private capital. He never mentioned that the limitless private capital was actually his 70-year-old father-in-law, who he was actively trying to lock in a state-run nursing home. The meal ended, and the waiter cleared the empty porcelain plates. Bradley was feeling incredibly confident. He believed he had the freight executives perfectly fooled. He thought he was just minutes away from securing a partnership that would finally legitimize his failing company. The waiter returned to the table and placed a black leather checkbook next to Bradley's coffee cup. The bill for the breakfast was over $600. Bradley did not even flinch. He smiled broadly at his guests, told them breakfast was on him, and reached into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket. He pulled out the silver corporate credit card that was directly linked to my master accounts. He dropped it onto the leather booklet with a practiced flick of his wrist. It was a gesture designed to look casual, but it was entirely calculated to show the executives that $600 meant absolutely nothing to him. The waiter picked up the card and walked away toward the register. Bradley went back to boasting about his quarterly projections. He was completely oblivious to the financial guillotine that had already dropped across town. 10 minutes passed. The conversation began to slow down. One of the freight executives checked his watch, clearly ready to leave. Bradley looked toward the kitchen doors, feeling a tiny prick of annoyance that the waiter was taking so long. Finally, the waiter reappeared, but he was not holding a pen and a receipt. He was holding the silver card between his fingers, and his face wore an expression of deep professional discomfort. The waiter leaned down very close to Bradley's ear and whispered softly that the card had been declined. Bradley let out a short and arrogant laugh. He told the waiter to run it again, claiming that the bank's fraud department was probably just being overly cautious because of the high transaction amount. His voice was just loud enough for the 2 executives to hear. He wanted them to know that his credit limit was so massive that the bank had to double-check his ordinary purchases. The waiter shook his head slowly. He informed Bradley that he had already tried running the card 3 times and that the terminal was displaying a hard freeze code. The bank was refusing to process the transaction and had requested that the merchant confiscate the physical card. The confident smile on Bradley's face froze and then slowly began to melt. A cold bead of sweat formed at the base of his neck. He quickly reached into his pocket and pulled out his personal debit card. This account was a joint account he shared with Vanessa, which was heavily funded by the quarterly distributions from my trust. He handed the debit card to the waiter and apologized to the executives, making a weak joke about the incompetence of modern banking algorithms. The executives did not laugh. They simply stared at him with cold, evaluating eyes. They were men who dealt with millions of dollars in liquid assets every single day, and they knew exactly what a declined card looked like. The waiter returned less than 2 minutes later. He did not whisper this time. He placed the debit card down on the table and stated flatly that this card had also been completely declined. The silence that fell over the private dining room was absolute and suffocating. The clinking of silverware and the low hum of conversation from the main restaurant seemed to vanish. Bradley stared at the two useless pieces of plastic sitting on the white tablecloth. His heart began to pound against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached for his smartphone and frantically opened his mobile banking application. He typed in his password with shaking fingers. The loading wheel spun for a few agonizing seconds before the screen refreshed. Where there should have been a comfortable 6-figure balance, there was only a stark red error message indicating that the account was locked and unavailable for viewing. He tried to log into his business portal. The same red message appeared. He was locked out of his own life. The reality of his situation crashed down on him with the weight of a collapsing building. He was sitting in a luxury restaurant with two of the most powerful men in his industry, and he did not have the money to pay for his own scrambled eggs. He had spent the last hour bragging about his limitless capital, and now he was completely exposed as a fraud. The older of the two freight executives let out a heavy, disappointed sigh. He reached into his own worn leather wallet and pulled out a plain corporate card. He tossed it onto the table, covering Bradley's declined plastic. The executive looked at Bradley with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He did not say a single word about the business partnership. He did not mention the volume contracts or the distribution networks. He simply told Bradley that they would be in touch and stood up from the table. The two men walked out of the room, leaving Bradley sitting entirely alone in the aftermath of his own profound humiliation. Bradley sat frozen in his chair, staring blankly at the wall. The expensive suit suddenly felt like a straitjacket. He tried to call Vanessa, but her phone went straight to voicemail. He tried to call the automated banking hotline, but the robotic voice simply repeated that his social security number was no longer associated with any active accounts. The panic completely overtook him. It was a primal, desperate terror. He realized that the financial life support system he had relied on for years had been brutally and efficiently severed. He stumbled out of the restaurant and into the bright morning sunlight, gasping for air as if he were drowning. He walked toward the valet stand with heavy, dragging footsteps. The young valet brought around his imported luxury sedan. Bradley had leased the car just 3 months ago, telling everyone it was a company vehicle purchased with his first quarter profits. The truth was that I had co-signed the lease agreement and paid the massive down payment. Bradley stood by the open door of the beautiful car and realized with a sickening drop in his stomach that he did not even have $5 in cash to tip the valet. He had to avert his eyes and mumble an apology, climbing into the leather seat, while the young man stared at him in quiet judgment. Bradley gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror and saw a terrified imposter staring back. The insulated world he and Vanessa had built on a foundation of my hard-earned money was evaporating around him in real time. He put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, knowing that this was only the very beginning of the nightmare he had brought upon himself. I was sitting in the leather armchair in my study when I heard the familiar sound of tires skidding recklessly onto my gravel driveway. I did not need to look out the window to know it was Vanessa. I simply placed my teacup on the coaster and waited in the quiet room. It had been exactly 4 hours since I froze the accounts at the bank. That gave Bradley just enough time to experience his public humiliation at the restaurant and frantically call his wife. I knew exactly how Vanessa operated under pressure. She would not stop to think logically. She would not consult an attorney to understand her actual legal standing. She would drive straight to my house expecting to bully me into absolute submission, just like she had always done when her mother was alive. I listened to the heavy thud of her luxury vehicle door slamming shut. Her rapid, angry footsteps echoed loudly up the wooden steps of my front porch. I heard the familiar jingle of her massive, heavy keychain. For the last 10 years, Vanessa had carried a brass key to my front door. She used it whenever she wanted to raid my expensive wine cellar or drop off her dry cleaning for my housekeeper to manage. I heard the metal key slide smoothly into the deadbolt. I heard her turn it forcefully, expecting the door to swing wide open. Then I heard the satisfying metallic clunk of the key, refusing to engage. I had called a private emergency locksmith on my way home from the bank earlier that morning. Every single exterior lock on the property had been completely replaced with high-security biometric cylinders. Her brass key was now completely useless metal. She rattled the brass doorknob violently. She pounded her bare fist against the thick oak wood. I sat perfectly still in my quiet study listening to the echo of her raw anger. Then the heavy pounding suddenly stopped. I knew exactly what she was looking at. Taped at eye level right above the brass knocker was a formal legal notice of criminal trespass. It was printed on the official thick letterhead of my corporate attorney. It stated in absolute terms that Vanessa was no longer permitted on the premises, and that any further attempts to enter the property would result in an immediate police dispatch and arrest. My cell phone began to vibrate loudly on the polished mahogany desk. The bright caller identification screen displayed her name. I did not pick it up. I let it ring until it automatically transferred to my answering machine. I pressed the speaker button so I could hear her message fill the empty room. Her voice came through the small speaker dripping with a toxic mixture of blind panic and absolute rage. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask if I was confused or feeling unwell. The theatrical illusion of the caring daughter from the restaurant had completely evaporated. "Dad, pick up the phone right now," she screamed. Her voice was shaking so hard the audio actually clipped. "Bradley just called me from downtown. His corporate cards are completely frozen. Our joint checking accounts are locked out. I know you did this. I know you changed the locks on the front door. You are completely out of your mind. You cannot just cut us off without any warning. We have massive payments due tomorrow. We have a lifestyle to maintain. If you do not call the bank and fix this entire mess by 5 this afternoon, I am taking you to court." I leaned back in my leather chair and listened to her dig her own grave. "I am not playing games with you, Dad." She continued, her tone growing even more vicious and cruel. "You humiliated me. You made me look like a complete fool. I already have the power of attorney paperwork drawn up and ready to file. I have doctors ready to testify that your grief over Mom has made you a severe danger to yourself. If you do not unlock my money immediately, I will go to a federal judge tomorrow morning and have you declared legally incompetent. I will force you into a state-run facility so fast your head will spin. I will take absolutely everything, and you will spend the rest of your life locked in a tiny room eating hospital food. Call me back right now or else." The machine beeped loudly, signaling the end of the recording. The silence returned to my study, but it was a very different kind of silence now. It was the calm before a massive, unavoidable storm. Vanessa thought she was holding a winning hand. She thought the threat of a conservatorship would terrify me into giving her the access codes. She truly believed that an old man would surrender his fortune just to avoid a stressful legal public battle. She had absolutely no idea that I had already recorded the entire voicemail and forwarded the digital audio file directly to the secure server of my attorney. She thought she was threatening a vulnerable, grieving widower, but she had just handed a master forensic accountant the exact piece of evidence he needed to destroy her completely. I picked up my wool coat and walked toward the door. It was time to expand the chessboard. I took the private elevator up to the 42nd floor of the glass skyscraper that housed the most ruthless corporate law firm in the entire city. The polished steel doors opened silently into a massive reception area lined with dark mahogany wood and modern art. I did not need to stop and announce myself to the receptionist. I walked straight down the long carpeted corridor toward the corner office at the very end of the hall. Mitchell Reed was sitting behind his massive polished stone desk, surrounded by towering bookshelves filled with thick legal volumes. Mitchell was 65 years old, with perfectly groomed silver hair and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He was not just my attorney. He was my oldest friend and my longest-standing chess partner. We had spent the last 30 years anticipating each other's moves on a carved wooden board. But today we were not playing a simple game with wooden pieces. Today we were playing with the lives of two incredibly arrogant people who had foolishly decided to declare war on the wrong man. Mitchell looked up from his paperwork as I walked into the room. He saw the cold, rigid expression on my face and immediately closed his laptop computer. He pointed to the heavy leather chair across from him and told me to sit down. I did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. I pulled my cell phone from my coat pocket and placed it squarely in the center of his immaculate desk. I pressed the screen and played the audio file of the voicemail Vanessa had left me just an hour ago. The sound of my daughter's screaming voice filled the quiet, elegant office. We listened together in absolute silence as she furiously threatened to lock me in a state-run medical facility. We listened as she aggressively admitted to having fraudulent medical experts ready to testify against my sanity. We listened as she demanded that I unlock her money immediately or face complete and utter ruin. When the harsh recording finally ended, the heavy silence returned to the room. Mitchell did not look shocked. He did not look appalled or offended by her complete lack of morality. He leaned back in his expensive chair and steepled his fingers together, resting them thoughtfully beneath his chin. A slow, deliberate smile spread across his face. It was the exact same dangerous smile he wore right before he trapped my king in an inescapable corner on the chessboard. Mitchell leaned forward and pressed a button on his desk console, explicitly instructing his paralegal to hold all of his incoming calls for the rest of the morning. He looked at my phone as if it were a glowing piece of radioactive material that we could weaponize against our enemies. "Calvin," he said softly, "your daughter just handed us the absolute keys to her own destruction." He explained that in any legal conservatorship battle, the hardest thing to prove in front of a judge is malicious intent. Usually, adult children can hide behind the convincing facade of deep emotional concern for their aging parents. They can cry and play the victim in a courtroom, claiming they only want what is medically best for a rapidly declining father. But Vanessa had just destroyed that entire defensive strategy with her own voice. By explicitly tying her vicious threats of a conservatorship to my refusal to fund her husband's failing business, she had officially crossed the line from a concerned family member into felony extortion. She had permanently documented her own premeditated intent to commit financial fraud on a recorded line. Mitchell stated that any judge in the country would listen to that audio tape and immediately throw her case out of court. But he also noted that we were not just going to sit around and wait for her to file her frivolous lawsuit. We were going straight on the offensive. I told Mitchell about the bank manager and the forged power of attorney document that Vanessa had desperately tried to use earlier that morning. I detailed exactly how she had lifted my digital signature and stamped it with a fraudulent county notary seal. Mitchell began taking rapid, aggressive notes on a yellow legal pad, his gold pen scratching loudly against the paper. He told me that we were now dealing with multiple overlapping layers of criminal liability. We had attempted wire fraud, we had document forgery, and now we had recorded extortion. He looked me dead in the eye and asked me if I wanted him to contact the district attorney right now and have them both arrested before dinner. I shook my head slowly. I told Mitchell that putting them in handcuffs right now would be far too easy, and it would allow them to play the victim card to the rest of our extended family. I did not want them to go to jail, while they still believed they were wealthy and powerful. I wanted them to feel the absolute crushing terror of losing everything they had built on my dime. I wanted their entire financial foundation to crumble beneath their feet before the authorities ever knocked on their front door. I wanted them to understand the exact magnitude of their profound arrogance. Mitchell stopped writing and looked at me with a deep, unspoken understanding. He knew exactly how my mind worked, because we had spent our entire careers dismantling arrogant people who believed they were entirely untouchable. He set his pen down and asked me what my next move was going to be. I told him that freezing the bank accounts was only the opening gambit. It was the equivalent of taking their pawns off the board simply to see how they would react to losing control. Vanessa had reacted with blind rage and sloppy threats, confirming that she was acting entirely out of financial desperation rather than any real, calculated legal strategy. Now it was time to move my heavy pieces into position. I reached down to the floor and picked up my leather briefcase. I unsnapped the brass locks and pulled out a thick stack of old manila folders. These were not recent bank statements or stock portfolios. These were the original property deeds and corporate shell company documents I had kept completely hidden from my family for over a decade. I placed the heavy folders on Mitchell's desk right next to my cell phone. I slid the top folder toward him and told him it was time to talk about the commercial warehouse where Bradley was currently running his logistics empire. I told Mitchell that Bradley believed he leased that massive building from a faceless real estate conglomerate, but the truth was far more dangerous. Mitchell opened the top manila folder, and his eyes scanned the old ink on the original deed of trust. He saw my signature listed as the sole primary shareholder of the holding company that owned the property. He let out a low whistle of genuine admiration, realizing the sheer scale of the trap I had built years ago. He realized that Bradley had been pouring all of his business capital into a building that I completely controlled. I explained to Mitchell that I had originally purchased that commercial property years ago to give my daughter a silent head start in life. I had kept my name entirely off the public lease agreements to preserve Bradley's fragile male ego, so he could boast to his friends that he negotiated a brilliant real estate deal all by himself. But now that very same building was going to become the anvil we used to break him. I instructed Mitchell to begin drafting the paperwork to transfer the entire property deed out of my holding company and place it directly into an irrevocable trust. I told him I wanted the legal walls to close in on them so tightly that they would not even be able to breathe without my explicit permission. We sat in the quiet office high above the city and began to meticulously engineer the absolute destruction of their false empire. Mitchell opened the heavy manila folder and carefully spread the fragile original property documents across the surface of his polished stone desk. He adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to examine the corporate seals stamped at the bottom of the pages. The document was a master deed for a 40,000 square foot industrial warehouse located in the prime commercial district on the south side of the city. To the general public and to the local tax authorities, this massive property was entirely owned by a generic-sounding holding company called Apex Solutions. But Mitchell was looking at the private internal shareholder registry, which clearly proved that I was the sole owner and primary director of the entire corporation. I watched Mitchell trace his finger over the signature line, and I took a moment to explain the bitter history behind the purchase. 5 years ago, Bradley came to my house begging for a massive loan. He had just started his logistics company, and he was already on the verge of total bankruptcy because he could not secure a reliable base of operations. He was disorganized, arrogant, and completely lacking in basic business acumen. Commercial landlords took one look at his terrible credit history and practically laughed him out of their leasing offices. Diane was still alive back then, and she was absolutely terrified that Vanessa would end up living on the street if the company collapsed. She begged me to help them, but she also begged me not to humiliate Bradley by making him feel like a charity case. So I utilized my decades of experience in forensic accounting to construct a completely invisible safety net. I quietly formed the holding company and purchased the warehouse complex for cash. I then instructed my anonymous property manager to reach out to Bradley and offer him an unbelievable leasing agreement. The rent I charged him was exactly 20% of the actual market value. It was a massive financial subsidy disguised as a stroke of incredible business luck. Bradley, of course, never questioned why a major corporate landlord was offering him such a miraculously cheap lease. He immediately signed the contract and spent the next 5 years bragging loudly at every family dinner about his brilliant, aggressive negotiation skills. He truly believed he had outsmarted a massive real estate conglomerate. He never realized he was simply playing in a sandbox that I had built and paid for. Mitchell listened to the entire story with a look of absolute professional awe. He shook his head slowly, marveling at the sheer scale of the deception and the breathtaking arrogance of a son-in-law who was currently trying to destroy the very man who owned the roof over his head. Mitchell pointed out that because the holding company was a completely private entity, Vanessa had absolutely no idea that this asset even existed. She had spent months snooping through my mail and checking my personal bank statements looking for leverage, but she had never found a single trace of the warehouse because the corporate property taxes were paid through an entirely separate blind account. I told Mitchell that the time for subsidies was officially over. I instructed him to immediately draft the legal paperwork to dissolve the holding company and completely transfer the physical deed of the warehouse into a new financial vehicle. I did not want to simply evict Bradley, because eviction is a long and messy process that would give him time to play the victim in housing court. Instead, I wanted to weaponize the property itself. I told Mitchell to transfer the entire estate into an irrevocable charitable trust dedicated to the funding of pediatric cancer research, which was a cause Diane had supported her entire life. Mitchell immediately understood the devastating brilliance of this specific strategy. By placing the warehouse into an irrevocable trust, I was legally removing the massive asset from my own personal estate forever. Once the ink was dry on the transfer documents, I would no longer own the building. Therefore, even if Vanessa somehow miraculously managed to bribe a judge and win her fraudulent conservatorship case, she would never be able to touch the property. She could not sell it, and she could not use it as collateral for a bank loan. The warehouse would belong entirely to the charity, and the charity would be managed by a fiercely independent board of aggressive financial trustees. But the true genius of the trap lay in the strict legal obligations of the new trustees. Mitchell explained that under state law, the board of a charitable trust has an absolute fiduciary duty to maximize the financial returns of their donated assets. They are legally forbidden from offering discounted rent to commercial tenants, because doing so would be stealing money away from the charity itself. The very minute the trust assumed ownership of the building, they would be legally required to instantly terminate the heavily subsidized lease agreement and bring the monthly rent up to the current aggressive market rate. We calculated the exact numbers right there in the office. The monthly rent for the warehouse was going to skyrocket from a comfortable $3,000 a month to a crippling $15,000 a month, effective immediately. And because Bradley had already signed a commercial lease that included a standard variable rate adjustment clause, he had absolutely no legal grounds to fight the massive increase. He would owe the new staggering amount on the first day of the following month, which was exactly 4 days away. We already knew from the incident at the restaurant that his bank accounts were entirely empty and his corporate credit cards were completely frozen. He would have absolutely no way to pay the new rent, and the charitable trust would have zero hesitation in locking him out of the building and seizing his assets the very second his check bounced. I leaned forward and told Mitchell that raising the rent was only the first half of the strike. I wanted to expose the fraudulent business practices to the entire world. I instructed Mitchell to invoke paragraph 7 of the original commercial lease agreement. It was a standard corporate compliance clause that granted the landlord the right to conduct a comprehensive mandatory audit of the physical premises and the internal inventory at any given time. For 5 years, I had quietly waived this requirement, allowing Bradley to operate his warehouse without any oversight whatsoever. But the new charitable trust would not be so forgiving. I knew for a fact that Bradley was lying to his investors and his freight vendors about the actual volume of goods moving through his logistics company. He claimed to have a massive inventory of high-value electronics and imported machinery, but I had parked across the street from his loading docks late at night and watched his operation. The warehouse was practically empty. He was moving cheap bulk goods and staging empty crates near the front doors to make the facility look extremely busy whenever potential clients came to visit. He was running a massive illusion built entirely on empty cardboard boxes and sheer arrogance. The mandatory audit would completely destroy that carefully crafted illusion. Mitchell drafted a formal legal notice stating that an independent team of commercial auditors would be arriving at the warehouse the following morning to conduct a full physical count of the inventory and review his environmental compliance records. If Bradley refused them entry, he would be in direct violation of his lease, and the trust would immediately call the local sheriff to execute a commercial lockout. The auditors would walk through his massive 40,000 square foot warehouse and document the absolute lack of valuable inventory. They would compile a highly detailed legal report that would become public record, exposing him as a complete fraud to every single vendor and investor he had ever lied to. Mitchell typed furiously on his keyboard, inputting the final legal clauses into the transfer documents. The heavy laser printer in the corner of the office hummed to life, slowly churning out the thick stack of premium watermarked paper. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. I felt an incredible sense of calm wash over me. I was not doing this out of spite or petty revenge. I was doing this to completely dismantle a toxic structure that was slowly suffocating my family. I was performing a silent correction, an absolute realignment of reality that would force Vanessa and Bradley to finally face the true consequences of their own destructive actions. Mitchell brought the warm printed pages over to a small glass table and handed me his heavy gold fountain pen. I sat down and carefully signed my name on the exact lines he indicated. I signed the dissolution of the holding company. I signed the transfer of the property deed. I signed the authorization for the new charitable trust. With every single stroke of the pen, I felt the heavy burden of my daughter's entitlement lifting off my shoulders. I was giving away a multi-million-dollar asset, but I had never felt wealthier in my entire life. Mitchell gathered the signed documents and placed the official embossed corporate seal on the front pages. He pressed a button on his desk, and his paralegal immediately walked into the room. Mitchell handed the documents to her and instructed her to call their fastest bonded legal courier. He wanted the notice of the massive rent hike and the mandatory premises audit delivered directly into the hands of my son-in-law before the end of the business day. The paralegal nodded sharply and left the room carrying the absolute destruction of an entire career in a simple manila envelope. I sat back down in the leather chair and looked at Mitchell. He was smiling again, but it was a quiet, respectful smile. The opening moves of the chess match were officially over. The traps had been perfectly set, and the board had been completely flipped. We poured 2 glasses of sparkling water and toasted silently to the absolute precision of the law, knowing that my son-in-law was currently sitting in his empty warehouse completely unaware that the walls were about to collapse directly on top of his head. I drove back to my house that afternoon, feeling a profound sense of clarity. The charitable trust paperwork was already being processed by the state, and the mandatory audit notice was currently sitting in the hands of a courier making its way to Bradley's warehouse. But I knew my daughter. I knew that the freezing of her bank accounts would not trigger any introspection or remorse. It would trigger a wild and reckless counterattack. My phone rang just as I was pulling into my driveway. It was Mitchell. He told me that Vanessa and Bradley had just officially retained legal counsel to aggressively pursue the medical conservatorship. They did not hire a reputable family law attorney from a respected firm. They hired a man named Richard Thorne. Richard was a notorious bottom feeder in the local legal community. He was an aggressive and sleazy litigator who specialized in predatory elder law. He made his entire living by filing frivolous emergency conservatorships and terrorizing elderly people into surrendering their assets just to avoid the stress of a massive public trial. Mitchell warned me that Richard did not play by the traditional rules of the courtroom. He relied entirely on shock and awe tactics designed to humiliate his targets into absolute submission. I sat in the driver's seat of my parked car and smiled grimly at the absolute predictability of their actions. I knew exactly why they had hired a man like Richard. Reputable lawyers require massive retainer fees up front, and they conduct thorough background checks before filing emergency medical injunctions. Vanessa and Bradley did not have the money for a massive retainer because I had completely severed their access to my capital earlier that morning. They were running entirely on fumes and sheer financial desperation. Richard was the only type of lawyer who would take their case on contingency completely blind to the actual financial reality of the situation. He looked at my public profile, saw a wealthy 70-year-old widower, and automatically assumed I was a massive payday waiting to happen. He had no idea he was stepping onto a battlefield heavily mined by a retired federal forensic investigator. Mitchell explained that Richard's signature move was the public ambush. He never mailed court summons politely through the postal service. He hired aggressive private process servers to deliver the legal papers in the most public and humiliating way possible. He wanted the neighbors to watch. He wanted the elderly target to feel completely isolated, confused, and ashamed. Mitchell strongly advised me to pack a small travel bag and stay at a private luxury hotel for the next few days to avoid the inevitable circus on my front lawn. But I politely refused his advice. I told Mitchell that I was not going to hide in the shadows of my own life like a frightened old man. I wanted to look my enemies right in the eye when they tried to strike their heaviest blow. I spent the rest of the evening sitting in my quiet study drinking a cup of hot black tea and watching the street through my large front window. I knew they were coming soon. Vanessa wanted to break my spirit, and she desperately wanted an audience to witness my crushing defeat. My house was located in a highly exclusive neighborhood filled with retired doctors, corporate executives, and federal judges. Vanessa wanted these powerful, wealthy neighbors to see me treated like a senile, incompetent patient. She calculated that the sheer, overwhelming embarrassment of a public legal ambush would force me to immediately surrender the access codes to my bank accounts, just to make the humiliating spectacle stop. It was a cruel and highly calculated psychological attack, born from the exact same toxic entitlement that had driven her to steal my folio at the restaurant the night before. The next morning arrived with a clear blue sky and a biting, harsh winter wind. I woke up early and put on my best tailored wool suit. I polished my leather shoes and stood in my kitchen, drinking my morning coffee, waiting with absolute patience. I felt the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a man who held all the winning cards in his hand. At exactly 10 o'clock, a rusted silver sedan turned onto my quiet, tree-lined street. The loud engine and the squealing brakes did not belong in this peaceful neighborhood. The car parked aggressively right in front of my manicured lawn, completely blocking my pristine driveway. Two people got out of the vehicle and slammed the heavy metal doors. The first was a massive, heavily tattooed man wearing a tight black shirt and holding a thick stack of legal documents attached to a wooden clipboard. He was the private process server hired by the sleazy lawyer to execute the ambush. The second person to step onto the sidewalk was my own daughter. Vanessa had actually come along to personally watch the execution of her brilliant plan. She stood on the edge of my property wearing dark, oversized sunglasses and a thick, expensive designer coat, folding her arms tightly across her chest with an expression of absolute smug anticipation. Bradley was entirely absent, presumably dealing with the catastrophic failure of his corporate credit cards at his warehouse. But Vanessa was more than ready to carry the torch of their arrogance. She was looking directly at my heavy oak front door, waiting for the massive process server to drag me out onto the porch and humiliate me in front of the entire neighborhood. Several of my wealthy neighbors had already stopped walking their dogs and were looking over at the commotion with deep curiosity. Vanessa wanted a public stage, and she had successfully built one. She truly thought she was about to deliver the final killing blow to my independence. She believed she was holding the ultimate trump card that would force me to beg for her mercy. She had absolutely no idea that she was standing on a piece of property that I no longer legally owned, and that her massive public ambush was about to become the exact instrument of her own spectacular ruin. I watched through the thick glass of my front window as the massive, heavily tattooed process server marched across my perfectly manicured green lawn. His heavy work boots crushed the delicate frost that still clung to the morning grass, leaving deep, ugly footprints behind. He walked with the aggressive swagger of a man who was used to intimidating vulnerable people into absolute submission. Right behind him walked my daughter, Vanessa. She was practically vibrating with a toxic mixture of nervous energy and pure, smug satisfaction. She kept glancing over her shoulder to make sure the neighbors were watching the spectacle she had orchestrated. And they definitely were. Susan, a retired federal judge who lived directly across the street, had paused her morning walk and was standing on the sidewalk, holding her golden retriever by the leather leash. Mr. Gable, a former orthopedic surgeon, was standing on his porch, pretending to read the morning newspaper, but his eyes were fixed entirely on my front yard. Vanessa had successfully assembled the exact wealthy and influential audience she desperately wanted. She wanted these prominent people to witness the spectacular public fall of Calvin Foster. She wanted them to see me dragged out of my beautiful house looking like a confused, fragile old man who could no longer manage his own life and needed his gracious daughter to save him. I did not wait for the massive process server to reach my heavy oak door. I did not want them pounding on the wood and creating a cheap, theatrical scene that would disturb the quiet morning. I placed my empty teacup on the hallway table, smoothed the lapels of my tailored wool suit, and unlocked the front door. I stepped out onto the wide brick porch, standing perfectly straight, with my hands clasped loosely behind my back. The cold winter wind bit fiercely at my face, but I did not shiver. I looked down at the two of them with the cold, detached, and highly clinical observation of a forensic accountant examining a deeply flawed spreadsheet. The process server stopped abruptly at the bottom of the brick steps. He looked genuinely surprised that I was already standing there waiting for him. Usually, the frightened elderly people he hunted tried to hide behind their living room curtains or sneak out the back door to avoid him. He recovered his aggressive posture very quickly, puffing out his chest and holding the thick stack of legal documents up like a blunt weapon. Vanessa stopped right next to him. She took off her oversized designer sunglasses and looked up at me with cold, calculating eyes. She immediately began her loud public performance, projecting her voice so the wealthy neighbors across the street could hear every single deliberate word. "Dad, you need to just accept these papers," she called out, using a voice that was dripping with fake sympathy and real toxic malice. "We are doing this for your own good because we love you. You are not well anymore. You are confused and you are making terrible financial decisions that are going to ruin our entire family. Just take the court summons and let the doctors help you. It does not have to be this incredibly hard." I looked at my daughter. I looked at the expensive designer coat I had paid for and the diamond earrings I had bought her for her 30th birthday. I listened to her loudly declare my mental incompetence to the entire neighborhood while simultaneously holding a forged legal document in her back pocket. I did not feel a single ounce of the humiliation she was trying so desperately to inflict upon me. I only felt a profound sense of absolute finality. The last remaining fragile thread of paternal obligation I felt toward her snapped completely and vanished into the cold morning air. "Are you Calvin Foster?" the massive process server barked, stepping heavily up onto the first brick step and interrupting my silent thoughts. His voice was loud and harsh, deliberately designed to intimidate and overwhelm. I looked him directly in the eye. "I am Calvin Foster," I replied, my voice completely calm and entirely steady. The tattooed man marched up the remaining steps and forcefully shoved the thick stack of legal documents directly into my chest. "You have been officially served," he announced, loudly smirking, as if he had just accomplished something incredibly difficult and brave. He took a quick step back, pulling a small digital camera out of his dark jacket pocket to take a photograph of me holding the papers. This was the standard legal procedure required to prove to the judge that the physical delivery was successful. I did not drop the papers in shock. I did not throw them back at him or yell in angry protest. I simply took the heavy stack of documents and held them comfortably in my left hand. I looked down at the front page. The document was an emergency petition for medical conservatorship filed by Richard Thorne on behalf of my daughter. It was a vicious piece of legal fiction designed to completely strip me of my fundamental human rights and hand my entire financial portfolio over to a thief. But what interested me was not the ridiculous medical allegations contained inside the petition. What interested me was the specific residential address printed clearly at the very top of the formal court summons. I looked back up at the aggressive process server. I offered him a very polite and entirely genuine smile. "I am curious," I said, speaking clearly, so that my voice carried easily across the cold, quiet street. "Who exactly hired you to deliver these specific legal documents today?" The man lowered his digital camera, looking slightly confused by my unnervingly calm demeanor. "My boss, Richard Thorne, hired me," he grunted defensively. "And you are physically holding the papers, so the service is legally complete. You have to appear in probate court on Monday morning or face a bench warrant." I slowly shook my head. "I am afraid your service is completely invalid," I said, my tone remaining conversational and impeccably polite. "You see, a legal summons for a residential conservatorship hearing must be physically served to the defendant at their primary legal residence or their verified place of business. If the exact address printed on the legal filing does not perfectly match the actual legal residence of the defendant at the time of delivery, the probate court considers the service completely void and the petition must be entirely refiled with the clerk." Vanessa let out a loud, arrogant laugh that echoed across the lawn. She crossed her arms tightly and glared at me with pure contempt. "Stop embarrassing yourself, Dad," she sneered loudly. "You have lived in this exact house for 30 years. Your name is literally painted on the metal mailbox. Your luxury car is parked right there in the driveway. This is your primary legal residence and you were just served right on your own front porch. Everyone saw it happen. Susan saw it. Mr. Gable saw it. You cannot just use your boring accountant tricks to get out of this reality." I turned my gaze away from the confused process server and looked directly into my daughter's arrogant eyes. I watched the smug, overwhelming confidence radiating from her face. I took a deep breath of the freezing winter air and prepared to drop the massive invisible anvil directly onto her head. "You are absolutely right, Vanessa," I said calmly. "I have lived in this beautiful house for 30 long years. I raised you here. Your late mother planted those beautiful rose bushes by the edge of the driveway. This property holds a great deal of history, but history exists strictly in the past. And as of yesterday afternoon at exactly 3 o'clock, this property no longer belongs to me." Vanessa's arrogant smile froze instantly. Her crossed arms dropped slowly to her sides. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her loud theatrical voice suddenly entirely gone, replaced by a thin, breathless wheeze. "I sold the house," I stated clearly and deliberately. "I sold the entire estate to a prominent luxury condominium developer. It was a highly lucrative all-cash transaction. The legal deed was officially transferred and formally recorded at the county clerk's office yesterday afternoon. I am no longer the owner of this property, and I am no longer a legal resident of this specific address. I am simply here this morning to supervise the professional moving company that will be arriving in exactly 1 hour to pack up my remaining personal belongings." The process server looked down at the address printed on the legal summons, and then looked back up at me, his face turning a sickly shade of pale. He realized instantly that I was telling the absolute truth. He knew the strict, unbending technicalities of the law. By serving me at an address where I no longer legally resided, the entire expensive court filing was completely compromised. Richard Thorne was going to have to start the massive legal process all over again. But Vanessa was not thinking about the legal technicalities of the failed service. She was staring at the brick facade of the house in absolute crushing horror. For the last 5 years, she and Bradley had secretly listed this exact house as their primary collateral on the massive high-interest bridge loans they used to keep his failing logistics business afloat. They had forged my signature on the preliminary loan applications, banking entirely on the fact that they would soon control the entire estate through the medical conservatorship. They desperately needed the equity tied up in this house to save them from total catastrophic bankruptcy. "You sold the house," she repeated, her voice trembling violently in the cold air. Her eyes were wide with a sudden primal panic. "You cannot sell the house. That house is my inheritance. That house is supposed to pay for Bradley's business loans." I looked at her without a single ounce of paternal pity. "You have no inheritance, Vanessa," I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy register that cut right through the wind. "You tried to steal my life, so I completely erased your future. The massive funds from the sale of this house are already sitting permanently in a secure offshore trust that you will never, ever be able to touch. And since neither of you legally own this land, I highly suggest you both step off the developer's grass before I call the police and have you formally arrested for criminal trespass." I turned around, walked back inside the warm house, and firmly shut the heavy oak door. The lock clicked loudly, leaving her standing completely paralyzed on the freezing lawn, while the entire wealthy neighborhood watched her carefully constructed world completely collapse. I watched from the large bay window of my empty living room as Vanessa stumbled blindly across the frost-covered grass. She looked exactly like a person who had just stepped off the edge of a massive cliff and was suspended in midair, waiting for the inevitable harsh impact. She pulled her phone from her thick designer coat pocket, with hands that were shaking so violently she could barely unlock the illuminated screen. I knew exactly who she was frantically calling. She was calling her husband to warn him that the foundation of their entire criminal enterprise had just vanished into thin air. At that exact moment, on the other side of the city, Bradley was sitting in the freezing dark office of his massive empty warehouse. I knew his precise situation because my attorney Mitchell had already confirmed the courier delivery. Bradley was currently staring in absolute suffocating horror at the thick legal documents resting on his cheap laminate desk. He was looking at a mandatory rent increase that had just quintupled his monthly operating costs. He was staring at a formal notice of a comprehensive financial and physical inventory audit scheduled for the very next morning. His corporate credit cards were completely dead. His joint bank accounts were frozen solid. The comfortable insulated sandbox I had built for him was actively crushing him to death. When his cell phone suddenly rang, he likely thought it was another angry freight vendor demanding immediate payment for a bounced check. Instead, it was his panicked wife screaming into the receiver that my house had been sold. I had spent my entire professional career tracking the reckless, desperate movements of people who were trapped inside massive financial lies. I understood their exact methodology far better than they did. 2 years ago, when Bradley's logistics startup first began hemorrhaging cash, no legitimate commercial bank would approve him for a business loan. His corporate credit was entirely radioactive. So he and Vanessa turned to the dark shadow market of private equity. They went to a predatory lending syndicate that specialized in high-risk corporate bridge loans. These aggressive, unregulated firms do not care about credit scores or viable business plans. They only care about hard, physical collateral. And the specific collateral Vanessa and Bradley secretly offered them was the massive accumulated equity in my residential estate. I had discovered their terrible secret 3 months ago during a routine forensic background check on Bradley's public financial filings. I found a deeply buried lien intent filed against my own property address. They had forged my signature on a preliminary legal document promising the predatory lenders that the house would be officially transferred into Vanessa's name within 24 months. They took out an initial cash loan of $500,000 at an absolutely crippling interest rate. They firmly believed they could easily pay it back once they legally forced me into a state-run medical facility and liquidated my entire estate. It was a vicious, arrogant gamble built entirely on the assumption that I would quietly surrender and fade away in a tiny hospital room. But predatory lenders do not operate on family trust. They operate on strict, ruthless, automated legal algorithms. Every single week, their automated digital systems scan the county public records for any changes in the ownership status of their heavily leveraged collateral properties. When my attorney officially recorded the all-cash sale of my house to the luxury condominium developer the previous afternoon, a massive permanent red flag went up in the lender's system. The underlying collateral was completely vaporized. The asset they relied on was legally transferred to a protected offshore trust. Under the strict, unbending terms of their shadow contract, the entire $500,000 bridge loan was immediately called in. It was no longer a deferred debt waiting for an inheritance. It was a massive lump sum payment due immediately upon the loss of collateral. I imagined Vanessa driving recklessly across town to Bradley's warehouse. I pictured her slamming her luxury car into the loading dock parking lot and sprinting inside the empty building. The two of them were finally trapped in the exact same room, with nowhere left to hide. The arrogant illusion they had maintained for years was completely shattered. Bradley would be screaming about the massive rent hike and the impending corporate audit that would expose his entirely empty warehouse to the authorities. Vanessa would be screaming about the failed process server and the complete loss of the house. They would turn on each other like starved animals trapped in a very small cage. The catastrophic realization would hit them simultaneously. Without the house, they had no equity. Without equity, the predatory lenders would immediately seize Bradley's business assets. But because Bradley did not actually own the warehouse building, the lenders would quickly realize there was absolutely nothing of value to seize. The cardboard boxes sitting on his loading dock were completely worthless. The lenders would then move aggressively to freeze and seize their personal assets, including their leased luxury cars, their expensive furniture, and the joint bank accounts that I had already permanently locked down. The financial gravity of their situation was absolute. A normal person making a simple mistake can file for bankruptcy and slowly rebuild their life over a decade. But Vanessa and Bradley had committed multiple acts of federal fraud to secure those shadow loans. If they tried to file for bankruptcy protection, the federal bankruptcy courts would initiate a mandatory forensic audit of their historical finances. The court-appointed auditors would immediately discover the forged signatures, the fake power of attorney, and the fraudulent property claims. Filing for bankruptcy would not save them from their crippling debts. It would simply send them both directly to federal prison for bank fraud. Furthermore, I knew that Richard Thorne, the sleazy lawyer they had hired to execute the public ambush, would not wait around to be paid. When his aggressive process server reported back that the service was legally void and that the target had actually sold the primary asset, Richard would immediately realize there was no money left to steal from me. He would instantly drop their conservatorship case and send Vanessa a massive legal bill for his wasted time, threatening to sue them for breach of contract if they did not pay his exorbitant fees by the end of the week. Every single person they had hired or borrowed from was about to turn against them. They were completely paralyzed in a trap of their own terrible design. They could not move forward, and they could not retreat. I knew exactly how the afternoon would unfold for them. The predatory lenders would begin calling their cell phones constantly. The aggressive debt collectors would start sending threatening legal emails directly to Bradley's corporate inbox. The absolute terror of being entirely alone without my money to shield them would finally crush the remaining breath from their lungs. I had spent 40 years building a fortune to protect my family from the harsh realities of the world. Now I was using that exact same fortune to expose them to a reality they desperately deserved. They had woven a massive, intricate web of lies to steal my wealth, but they had foolishly tied every single string directly to my property. By selling the house, I did not just remove myself from their toxic reach. I pulled the master linchpin out of their entire financial machine, causing the entire structure to collapse. I sat in my quiet, warm study and listened to the professional moving crew arriving in my driveway. The movers began wrapping my antique furniture in thick, moving blankets, preparing to transport my life to a secure, luxury hotel downtown. I watched them work with a deep sense of absolute peace. The trap had successfully closed around my daughter and her husband. The heavy legal walls were sliding into place exactly as I had designed them. Their unraveling was completely inescapable, and it was entirely their own fault. I could picture the exact moment Vanessa burst through the doors of the industrial warehouse. She would have bypassed the empty reception desk and run straight back to Bradley's cheap laminate office. Bradley was already sitting in the dark, drowning in a cold sweat. He had just finished reading the legal notices delivered by the courier. He knew his rent had just skyrocketed to $15,000 a month, and he knew a team of ruthless commercial auditors was arriving at dawn to count his non-existent inventory. His carefully constructed empire of cardboard boxes was already crumbling around him. When Vanessa slammed the office door shut and screamed that I had sold the house, he did not comfort her. He did not hold his wife and tell her they would figure it out together. He likely stared at her with a look of pure, unadulterated horror as the final pillar of his massive financial lie was violently kicked away. For 2 years, they had managed to keep the predatory lending syndicate completely pacified by sending them forged documents showing the projected equity of my estate. They had promised those dangerous men that upon my inevitable medical decline, they would inherit a property worth over $2 million. It was the only reason the syndicate had allowed Bradley to carry a $500,000 bridge loan without making substantial monthly payments. But shadow banking operates on a hair trigger. These firms employ advanced algorithms that constantly monitor municipal property registries for any sudden changes in deed status. The moment my attorney Mitchell officially recorded the all-cash sale with the county clerk, an automated digital alarm went off in a windowless office across town. The algorithm recognized that the primary collateral backing the massive loan had evaporated into thin air. I knew exactly how the syndicate operated because I had spent a decade investigating their aggressive collection tactics. They do not send polite letters in the mail. They do not grant extensions or negotiate payment plans. They act with the swift, brutal efficiency of a financial firing squad. I imagined Bradley's cell phone buzzing on the desk right between them. He would look at the screen and see the blocked caller identification. His hand would tremble as he answered it, knowing exactly who was on the other end of the line. The voice on the phone would not belong to a friendly bank manager. It would be a cold, detached collections officer, informing him that Clause 4 of his shadow contract had just been officially triggered by the complete loss of collateral. The loan was no longer in a holding pattern. The entire balance of $500,000 plus an additional $60,000 in penalty fees was now due in full by the end of the business day. Bradley would try to use his aggressive salesman voice. He would pace around his empty office trying to sound like a powerful chief executive officer experiencing a minor temporary cash flow issue. He would promise them that a massive freight contract was coming through next week and beg them for just a few more days to secure alternative financing. But the collections officer would simply cut him off. Predators do not negotiate with cornered prey. The officer would calmly explain that because the primary collateral was gone, the syndicate was legally executing the secondary security agreement he had foolishly signed. They were immediately placing a massive sweeping lien on every single active bank account attached to his corporate tax identification number. The phone call would end with a sharp click, leaving Bradley standing in the suffocating silence of his own absolute ruin. He would drop the phone and frantically open his laptop computer. His fingers would hit the keys with a desperate, frantic energy. He would log into his commercial banking portal, praying for a miracle that simply did not exist. I had already frozen the accounts connected to my name, but Bradley still had his primary operating accounts, where he deposited whatever meager revenue his logistics company actually managed to generate. He would watch the screen load, and then the true magnitude of his panic would finally set in. The numbers on the screen would not just be zero. They would be terrifying, massive, negative numbers. The predatory lenders had initiated an aggressive, automated sweep, instantly draining every single dollar he had left to cover their massive penalty fees. The account balances would plummet into the deep red, displaying -80,000, -100,000. The lenders were aggressively hitting the accounts over and over again, triggering thousands of dollars in overdraft penalties from the bank itself. The corporate accounts were not just empty, they were completely toxic. Any money he ever tried to deposit into those accounts in the future would be instantly swallowed by the massive negative balance. The reality of those red numbers would completely break him. He could not run his daily operations. He could not buy commercial fuel for the single delivery truck he actually owned. He could not pay his warehouse staff their weekly wages, meaning they would walk off the job by tomorrow afternoon. His entire business was effectively dead, and the corpse was heavily chained to a $500,000 anchor. He would look up from the glowing screen and see Vanessa standing there shivering in her expensive designer coat. The panic would instantly turn into vicious mutual destruction. The illusion of their perfect marriage was built entirely on my money, and now that the money was gone, there was nothing left but blame. Bradley would scream at Vanessa for failing to secure the medical conservatorship faster. He would blame her for being too slow and too sloppy with the forged power of attorney. Vanessa would scream right back at him, blaming his incompetence and his fake business for draining her entire inheritance. They would tear each other apart in that cold, empty office. They were finally experiencing the exact terror they had tried so desperately to inflict upon me. I had simply stepped out of the way and allowed the massive, crushing weight of their own arrogance to completely flatten them. The penthouse suite of the grand luxury hotel was incredibly quiet. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the sprawling city skyline, holding a glass of sparkling water. The professional moving company had successfully placed my antique furniture into a secure, climate-controlled storage facility. I had paid for a 6-month lease on this temporary residence, using offshore funds that were completely untraceable to my former life. I was finally breathing clean air. The heavy toxic weight of my daughter's constant demands was entirely gone. Then the heavy brass knocker on my hotel door sounded. It was a frantic and deeply desperate rhythm. I did not need to check the security monitor to know who was standing in the hallway. Vanessa had always been incredibly resourceful when she wanted something. She had likely sobbed in the hotel lobby and bribed a young receptionist to give her my room number. I placed my glass on the cool marble counter and walked slowly toward the door. I unfastened the heavy security chain and pulled the thick wood open. Vanessa stood in the carpeted hallway, looking absolutely terrible. Her expensive designer coat was deeply wrinkled, and her premium makeup was smeared heavily underneath her eyes. She did not look like the arrogant, confident woman who had loudly declared me mentally incompetent on my front porch just a few hours ago. She looked like a terrified child who had finally touched a hot stove after being warned 100 times. She pushed past me into the suite without asking for permission and immediately collapsed onto the velvet sofa in the center of the room. She buried her face in her trembling hands and began to weep loudly. It was a theatrical performance perfectly designed to break my heart. She sobbed about how cruel the world was being to her. She cried about the predatory lenders who were currently draining her personal bank accounts and the aggressive auditors who were going to lock Bradley out of his warehouse by morning. She begged me to call my attorney and stop the bleeding. When I simply stood there in complete silence, she pulled out her ultimate weapon. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face and invoked the sacred memory of her mother. "How can you do this to your own family?" she cried, her voice echoing loudly in the quiet hotel suite. "Mom would be absolutely horrified if she could see what you are doing to us right now." Mom loved Bradley. Mom wanted us to be a happy and successful family. She made you promise to always take care of me before she passed away. You are destroying everything she built. You are destroying her entire legacy just because you are angry about a silly argument at a restaurant. She genuinely believed that using Diane as a human shield would instantly shatter my resolve. She thought the deep, profound grief I felt for my late wife would completely blind me to the reality of the situation. She expected me to sit down next to her, put my arm around her shoulder, and hand over the offshore trust routing numbers to save her from the absolute nightmare she had created. But she had entirely forgotten exactly who she was speaking to. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I felt a cold, sharp, and highly clinical disgust. I did not raise my voice. I did not tell her to stop crying. I simply walked over to the dark mahogany dining table where my leather briefcase was resting. I snapped the brass locks open and pulled out a thick, bound folder. It was not a legal summons or a real estate deed. It was a comprehensive forensic audit that I had personally conducted over the last 3 months in the complete silence of my study. I walked back over to the velvet sofa and dropped the heavy folder directly onto the glass coffee table right in front of her. The loud, sharp slap of the paper hitting the glass made her physically jump. I told her to wipe her eyes and look at the pages. I told her that her mother was a brilliant and deeply compassionate woman, but she was also a woman who believed in absolute honesty above all else. I told Vanessa that if Diane were sitting in this room right now, she would not be horrified by my actions. She would be completely horrified by the mathematical truth contained inside that folder. Vanessa looked down at the folder, but stubbornly refused to open it, so I reached down and opened it for her. I began reading the exact numbers aloud, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. I started with the $500,000 bridge loan they had illegally secured using my house as collateral. I read the exact date the funds were dispersed into Bradley's corporate account. Then I read the itemized list of every single purchase they made within the first 30 days of receiving that massive influx of stolen cash. They did not buy commercial freight trucks. They did not hire a professional logistics management team. They did not invest a single dollar into expanding their warehouse operations to generate actual revenue. Instead, I read aloud the transaction for $90,000 wired directly to a luxury European car dealership for Vanessa's imported sports car. I read the $85,000 charge for Bradley's custom-leased executive sedan. I read the $50,000 wire transfer to an exclusive tropical resort where they had spent 3 weeks drinking expensive champagne while pretending to be at a corporate logistics conference. I flipped to the next page of the audit. My voice was steady and relentless, exactly like a metronome ticking down the final seconds of their false reality. I listed the exorbitant restaurant bills, the thousands of dollars spent on designer clothing, and the massive monthly payments to a private country club, where Bradley networked with wealthy people he could never actually afford to do business with. I looked down at my daughter and mathematically proved to her that Bradley did not have a failing logistics business. He had absolutely no business at all. The massive warehouse was nothing more than an empty, expensive stage prop. They were running a personal lifestyle Ponzi scheme using shadow loans to fund a fake billionaire existence while desperately waiting for me to die so my inheritance could cover their massive illegal tracks. I told her that she had not stolen from a bank. She had stolen from her own future, and she had spent every last dime of it on completely worthless vanity. Vanessa stopped crying. The loud theatrical sobs completely vanished, replaced by a silent, suffocating horror. She stared at the highlighted bank statements and the undeniable concrete proof of her own profound greed. She realized in that exact moment that I knew absolutely everything. I had tracked every single stolen dollar, every single hidden wire transfer, and every single selfish decision she had made over the last 2 years. She could not manipulate me with tears because tears cannot change a forensic ledger. She could not use her mother's memory against me because her mother's memory demanded a level of integrity that Vanessa had completely abandoned. I stood over her and told her to take the folder. I told her she would need it when the federal bankruptcy courts asked her where the $500,000 went. I pointed to the heavy wooden door of my hotel suite and told her to leave. I told her that she had publicly demanded total control of her finances at the restaurant, and now she finally had it. She slowly picked up the heavy folder, her hands shaking violently. She did not say another word. She stood up, walked out of the suite, and the heavy door clicked shut behind her, leaving me in perfect, absolute peace. The digital clock on my hotel nightstand glowed softly in the dark room, displaying exactly 2 in the morning. I was not asleep. I was sitting in the comfortable armchair by the window, waiting for the inevitable notification. Desperate men do not sleep when their entire world is collapsing. They panic, and when they panic, they make incredibly stupid decisions. Bradley knew the auditors from the charitable trust were scheduled to arrive at his warehouse at exactly 7 in the morning. He also knew that his accounts were entirely frozen, and the predatory lenders were coming for his blood. He had exactly 5 hours to extract whatever meager value he could find before the heavy steel doors were permanently locked. My cell phone suddenly vibrated on the glass table. The screen lit up, displaying a high-resolution infrared video feed from the commercial security system I had secretly installed at the warehouse complex 2 years ago. I tapped the screen and watched the live footage unfold. I saw Bradley's luxury sedan pull into the dark, deserted parking lot. He did not park in his reserved executive spot. He parked the vehicle behind the massive industrial dumpsters, trying to remain completely hidden from the street. I watched through the camera as he stepped out of his car wearing dark clothing and carrying a heavy metal crowbar. He walked rapidly toward the main loading dock and pulled out his electronic key fob. He pressed the button, expecting the heavy steel bay doors to roll open. Nothing happened. The charitable trust had officially taken legal possession of the building at midnight, and they had immediately deactivated all previous access codes. I watched him strike the metal door with his hand in sheer frustration. But a drowning man does not simply walk away. Bradley moved toward the secondary employee entrance on the side of the building. He jammed the heavy steel crowbar into the doorframe and began to pry the metal apart with frantic, desperate strength. It took him 5 agonizing minutes of physical labor, but the heavy lock finally snapped. He pushed the door open and slipped inside the pitch-black warehouse. He completely failed to realize that the broken door did not trigger a loud, blaring siren. There were no flashing strobe lights to scare him away. I had explicitly instructed the security company to program the system as a silent alarm. The moment that door lock broke, a digital signal was sent directly to my phone and simultaneously dispatched to the local police department, reporting a felony break-in at a commercial property. I watched Bradley running through the dark, empty warehouse using the small flashlight on his cell phone to guide his way. He was not looking for his imaginary freight inventory, because there was none. He was frantically unplugging the expensive desktop computers from his administrative office and throwing them into plastic garbage bags. He was trying to steal his own office equipment so he could pawn it for a few $100s in cash. He was so entirely consumed by his frantic robbery that he did not notice the silent arrival of 3 police cruisers pulling into the dark parking lot. I sat in my quiet hotel room watching the live video feed as the bright red and blue emergency lights began to flash through the high warehouse windows, casting long, terrifying shadows across the empty concrete floor. Bradley froze, dropping a plastic bag full of stolen keyboards. The heavy warehouse doors suddenly slammed open, and the blinding beams of police flashlights cut entirely through the darkness, completely surrounding him. I watched the live video feed on my phone as 3 police officers advanced into the warehouse with their weapons drawn and flashlights piercing the darkness. Bradley dropped the plastic garbage bag full of stolen keyboards. It hit the concrete floor with a loud, harsh crash that the sensitive security microphones picked up perfectly. He immediately raised his hands above his head, his entire body shaking violently in the cold air. The lead officer ordered him to turn around and place his hands flat against the cold brick wall. Bradley tried to use his arrogant executive voice. He stammered frantically, telling the officers that there was a massive misunderstanding. He claimed he was the chief executive officer of the logistics company, and that he was simply working a late shift to prepare for an early morning audit. The lead officer did not lower his flashlight. He walked up to the broken side door and illuminated the heavy steel crowbar still resting on the concrete step. The officer calmly asked Bradley why a chief executive officer needed a crowbar to enter his own building in the middle of the night. Bradley had no logical answer. He stuttered about a lost set of keys, but his voice cracked completely under the intense pressure. The officer pulled a small radio from his heavy utility belt and verified the dispatch information with the local precinct. He stated clearly that the property was legally owned by a charitable trust, and that the trust had officially reported an unauthorized breach. Bradley tried to argue that he had a valid commercial lease, but the officer simply shook his head. He told Bradley that breaking a lock to enter a secured building, regardless of any previous leasing agreement, constitutes felony breaking and entering. The heavy metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoed sharply through the empty warehouse. I watched closely as the officer pulled Bradley's arms forcefully behind his back and secured his wrists. Bradley actually began to cry. It was not the quiet, dignified weeping of a man who had made an honest mistake. It was the loud, pathetic sobbing of a total coward who finally realized his arrogant actions had real physical consequences. He begged the police officers not to arrest him, claiming his massive business empire would fail if he was not sitting at his desk in the morning. The officers completely ignored his desperate pleas. They read him his Miranda rights, their firm voices echoing off the tall metal storage racks that were supposed to hold millions of dollars in valuable freight. They marched him roughly out of the dark warehouse and across the freezing asphalt parking lot. The high-definition security camera caught the exact moment they pushed his head down and shoved him into the hard plastic back seat of the police cruiser. The bright red and blue emergency lights illuminated his terrified face through the reinforced glass window. He looked absolutely pathetic. He was a man who had spent the last 5 years pretending to be an untouchable titan of industry, but in the end, he was just a common thief caught stealing cheap computer keyboards in the dark. The police cruisers drove away, leaving his expensive, leased luxury sedan abandoned right behind the industrial trash dumpsters. At 4 o'clock in the morning, my phone vibrated again. It was a brief text message from Mitchell confirming that Bradley had been officially booked into the county jail downtown. I knew exactly what was happening at that very moment back in my former neighborhood. Vanessa would have just received the automated phone call from the county detention center. She would be sitting alone in her dark kitchen, listening to a robotic voice tell her that her husband was currently sitting in a holding cell, facing multiple severe felony charges. The night magistrate would immediately set a cash bail amount before dawn. Normally, securing a bail bond is a simple financial transaction for people who pretend to be incredibly wealthy. But Vanessa and Bradley had absolutely nothing left to leverage. I had permanently locked down the primary family trusts. I had frozen all the corporate credit lines. The predatory lenders had ruthlessly drained every single penny from their joint operating accounts to cover their own massive penalty fees. Vanessa was completely cornered by her own profound greed. But I knew my daughter kept one final dirty secret. For the last 3 years, she had been quietly siphoning small amounts of cash from my monthly grocery and household maintenance allowance, hiding it in an obscure private savings account registered solely under her maiden name. She thought I was completely oblivious to the missing funds. She truly believed she had built a brilliant secret safety net just for herself, right under my nose. But as a veteran forensic accountant, I had tracked those missing funds on the very first day she stole them. I saw the hidden routing numbers and the quiet digital transfers. I never said a single word about it, because I knew that one day she would desperately need that exact stolen money to survive a catastrophic crisis of her own making. That specific crisis had officially arrived. To get her arrogant husband out of a cold, concrete jail cell, she was going to have to call a local 24-hour bail bondsman and drain the very last drop of her secret savings. She would have to wire the non-refundable fee to a stranger just to buy Bradley's temporary freedom. She was going to have to voluntarily empty the only financial lifeboat she had left, leaving her completely stranded in the middle of a massive, devastating ocean. Once that secret money was gone, she would have absolutely no way to buy food or pay for gasoline. She would finally experience the true suffocating terror of living paycheck to paycheck, without a safety net to catch her. I turned off my phone screen and laid back against the soft pillows of my hotel bed. I finally closed my eyes and went to sleep, knowing that when the sun came up, my daughter would be completely and entirely broke. Mitchell Reed's private boardroom was a masterpiece designed specifically for corporate intimidation. The walls were paneled in rich dark walnut, and the massive conference table in the center of the room was carved from a single flawless slab of polished black granite. I sat in a heavy leather chair near the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the tiny cars, navigating the city streets far below. The room was perfectly silent, except for the low hum of the climate control system. Mitchell sat at the head of the long table, calmly organizing a thin stack of manila folders. It had been exactly 2 days since Bradley was arrested in the dark warehouse. I knew the intense pressure of those 48 hours had fundamentally altered their reality. Then the heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung open, and my daughter walked into the room, followed closely by her husband. They looked absolutely terrible, but they still wore their toxic arrogance like a cheap suit of armor. Bradley had the hollow, exhausted look of a man who had just spent 2 nights sleeping on a concrete bench in a county holding cell. His expensive tailored suit was completely wrinkled and stained, his hair was greasy, and his face was covered in a thick, dark shadow of unkempt stubble. He kept his eyes fixed strictly on the floor, too ashamed to look directly at me. Vanessa, on the other hand, looked incredibly pale and dangerously thin, but she walked with her chin held high. I knew for a fact that she had completely drained her secret private savings account to pay the predatory non-refundable fee to the bail bondsman. They were absolutely destitute, standing on the very edge of total financial ruin. Yet despite their catastrophic circumstances, they walked into the room projecting a false aura of supreme confidence. They sat down together on the opposite side of the cold granite table. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly over her chest and stared at me with a look of supreme smugness. She truly believed in her delusional mind that I had called this formal meeting to surrender. She assumed that the stress of the last few days, the sudden sale of my house, and the looming threat of the medical conservatorship had finally broken my spirit. She believed I was terrified of being dragged into a public courtroom by her sleazy attorney, Richard Thorne. She had convinced herself and her husband that I was sitting in this room to offer them a massive multi-million-dollar financial settlement just to make the embarrassing lawsuit go away. She was completely ready to play the role of the merciful victor, granting a pardon to a defeated old man. Bradley cleared his throat loudly, trying desperately to summon the commanding executive voice he used to use before he became a convicted felon out on bail. He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the granite table, and laid out their ridiculous terms. He demanded that I immediately unfreeze his corporate credit cards and personally reimburse the massive penalty fees the shadow lenders had aggressively extracted from his empty accounts. He demanded that I pay him back for the bail money Vanessa had spent to get him out of jail, claiming his arrest was entirely my fault for changing the warehouse locks without telling him. Vanessa chimed in right after him, demanding a guaranteed permanent monthly stipend of $20,000 drawn directly from my offshore trusts. She stated with absolute arrogance that if I agreed to these terms and signed a legally binding financial contract today, she would call her lawyer and instruct him to completely drop the medical conservatorship petition. I sat there leaning back in my chair and listened to them list their absurd demands. I did not interrupt them. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of anger. I simply let them talk. I let them paint a beautiful, elaborate picture of a wealthy future they were never going to see. I watched them build a fantasy castle out of thin air. When they finally finished speaking, the heavy boardroom fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Mitchell did not say a word. He simply sat at the head of the table, resting his hands on his folders, watching them with the clinical, fascinating detachment of a biologist observing doomed insects trapped inside a glass jar. I looked directly into my daughter's arrogant eyes. I told her that she had fundamentally misunderstood the entire purpose of this meeting. I explained calmly that I was not here to negotiate a financial settlement because you simply cannot negotiate with people who possess absolutely zero leverage. Vanessa scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes in dramatic disbelief. She reminded me about the pending court date for the conservatorship, claiming she had sworn medical affidavits from doctors ready to destroy my reputation in front of a federal judge. I nodded slowly, acknowledging her threat, and then I looked at Mitchell. Mitchell reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a single crisp sheet of paper, sliding it smoothly across the black granite toward Vanessa. I told her to read the document very carefully. It was not a settlement offer or a negotiation of terms. It was a formal legal notice of immediate withdrawal from her own attorney, Richard Thorne. I watched her eyes dart frantically across the page as the horrific reality began to set in. Richard had officially dropped her as a client that very morning because he finally realized the primary real estate asset he wanted to steal had already been sold. He also included a massive itemized invoice for his wasted legal services, demanding immediate payment, or he would sue her for breach of contract. Before Vanessa could even process the loss of her lawyer, Mitchell pulled out a second heavy manila folder and dropped it onto the table. It landed with a sharp, satisfying thud. I looked at Bradley and told him that inside that folder was the official police report from his late-night arrest at the warehouse. But more importantly, it contained the highly detailed inventory of the specific items he had tried to steal in those plastic garbage bags. Because the charitable trust officially owned the building and everything inside it, the exact moment the deed was transferred, Bradley was not just facing a simple breaking and entering charge. He was facing federal commercial embezzlement. He had attempted to steal expensive computer equipment from a registered pediatric cancer charity. I told him that the district attorney was extremely eager to prosecute a wealthy executive who stole from sick children. Bradley's face lost all remaining color, and he slumped back into his chair as if he had been physically struck. Then Mitchell pulled out a third and final folder, placing it directly in the center of the table. This one contained the forged power of attorney document Vanessa had used at the bank earlier that week. I reminded Vanessa that wire fraud and document forgery carry a mandatory minimum sentence in federal prison. I told them that the district attorney currently possessed a complete copy of the crude forgery, the recorded voicemail of her extortion threats, and the fraudulent shadow loan applications they had secretly filed using my house as collateral. I mathematically proved to them that every single door they had ever tried to open was actually a trap I had carefully designed, and they had blindly walked into every single one of them. They were staring at the documents on the table with absolute crushing horror. The toxic, arrogant armor they had worn into the room had completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces, leaving them completely exposed, terrified, and broken. I leaned forward, resting my hands heavily on the cold granite. I told them they were currently facing decades in federal prison and absolute public disgrace. However, I told them I would make one single solitary offer. I would instruct Mitchell to hold the physical evidence of the forged power of attorney and the recorded extortion voicemail instead of submitting them to the federal prosecutor. But in exchange, they had to sign a permanent legally binding severance agreement right here and right now. They had to officially relinquish any and all future claims to my estate forever. They had to sign strict documents legally, barring themselves from ever contacting me, my bank, or my legal representatives again. And they had exactly 30 days to entirely liquidate what was left of their ruined lives and move out of the state completely. I looked at the digital clock on the boardroom wall and told them they had exactly 60 seconds to pick up the pen and sign the papers, or Mitchell was going to make a phone call to the district attorney and have federal marshals waiting for them in the lobby. The 60 seconds I gave them felt like an absolute eternity inside that cold granite room. I watched the second hand on the large wall clock sweep in a slow, continuous circle. Bradley stared at the thick stack of severance documents as if they were covered in a deadly poison. He was a man completely paralyzed by his own sudden irrelevance. Vanessa looked at me, her chest heaving as she struggled to pull oxygen into her lungs. She was desperately searching my face for any lingering trace of the father who used to buy her whatever she wanted. She found absolutely nothing but a cold, impenetrable wall. Mitchell sat perfectly still, his hands folded neatly on the table, waiting with the absolute patience of a seasoned executioner. Vanessa opened her mouth to argue, but the words completely died in her throat. She looked down at the forged power of attorney resting next to the police report from the warehouse. She finally understood the absolute terrifying magnitude of my trap. If she tried to fight me in court, she would have to explain to a federal judge why she forged my signature to steal $80,000. If Bradley tried to fight the charitable trust, he would have to explain why he was caught on security cameras stealing computers in the middle of the night. They had absolutely no defense. They had no expensive lawyer to protect them because Richard Thorne had abandoned them the moment the money vanished. They had no financial resources to hire a new attorney because the predatory lenders had drained their accounts to absolute zero. They were completely and utterly trapped in a cage they had built with their own bare hands. Mitchell leaned forward, breaking the heavy silence. He tapped his gold pen against the dark granite table, drawing their terrified attention. He informed them that the Charitable Trust Board had convened an emergency meeting early that morning. The board had reviewed the preliminary findings from the commercial auditors who were currently standing inside Bradley's empty warehouse. Mitchell stated that the auditors had officially classified the logistics company as a massive corporate fraud. There was absolutely no valuable inventory. There were no legitimate freight contracts. The trust had formally decided to permanently terminate the commercial lease effective immediately. Mitchell slid a formal eviction notice across the table. He told Bradley that he had exactly 30 days to vacate the warehouse completely. He had 30 days to clear his personal belongings out of the building and surrender the keys. If he ever stepped foot on the property after the 30th day, or if he attempted to remove any fixtures that legally belonged to the charity, the trust would press maximum federal embezzlement charges against him. Mitchell promised Bradley that he would personally ensure he spent the next 10 years in a maximum security prison. Then Mitchell turned his cold, professional gaze toward Vanessa. He explained the exact legal mechanism of the severance agreement sitting in front of her. He told her that by signing the documents, she was permanently disclaiming any and all future rights to my estate. She would be legally removed as a beneficiary from every single family trust. She would surrender any future claim to my offshore accounts, my stock portfolios, and my personal property. If she ever tried to contest my will after I passed away, this specific document would immediately trigger the release of her forged power of attorney directly to the district attorney, ensuring her immediate arrest even after my death. Their financial ruin was complete, legal, and entirely inescapable. There was no secret loophole. There was no hidden clause they could exploit. I had locked every single door and thrown the master key directly into the ocean. The large wall clock ticked loudly, signaling that 45 seconds had already passed. I looked at Vanessa and told her she had exactly 15 seconds left to make the most important decision of her entire life. I told her she could either sign the papers and walk out of this building with her freedom, or she could refuse to sign and walk out of this building in federal handcuffs. She looked at her husband. Bradley did not look back at her. He simply reached out with a trembling hand, picked up Mitchell's heavy gold fountain pen, and signed his name on the bottom line of the severance agreement. He did not read the dense legal paragraphs. He simply surrendered. He slid the document and the pen across the table toward his wife. Vanessa stared at the pen. A single tear rolled down her pale cheek, but it was not a tear of genuine remorse. It was a tear of profound, selfish grief for the massive fortune she had just permanently lost. She picked up the pen and pressed the gold tip against the thick paper. Her hand shook so violently that her signature was barely legible, but she managed to write her name completely, signing away her entire future. Mitchell smoothly pulled the signed documents back across the table. He placed them carefully inside his leather briefcase and clicked the brass locks shut. The sharp metallic sound echoed through the quiet boardroom, signifying the absolute end of their reign of terror. I stood up from my heavy leather chair and buttoned my suit jacket. I did not offer them any final words of paternal advice. I did not tell them I loved them or wish them luck. They were no longer my family. They were simply two strangers who had tried to rob me and failed spectacularly. I walked toward the heavy frosted glass doors without looking back. I left them sitting at the massive granite table, completely destitute, absolutely broken, and entirely alone. The magnificent architecture of their greed had finally collapsed, burying them completely under the rubble of their own profound arrogance. I looked down at the two people sitting at the heavy granite table. They were completely silent now. The toxic energy that had fueled their entire existence was entirely gone, leaving behind nothing but empty, hollow shells. I did not feel the crushing heartbreak that a father is supposed to feel when he loses a child. That heartbreak had already happened years ago on the day I realized my daughter viewed me not as a human being, but simply as a bank account waiting to be emptied. I took a deep breath of the cool, conditioned air and spoke my final words to them. I told Vanessa that a real family is never defined by shared blood or legal obligations. A real family is built entirely on a foundation of mutual respect, genuine loyalty, and an absolute refusal to cause each other harm. I told her that for my entire life, I had confused financial provision with actual love. I had subsidized her profound arrogance because I mistakenly thought it would buy me her affection. But true affection cannot be extracted by force, and it certainly cannot be stolen with a forged signature. I told her that her mother Diane would not want me to spend the remaining years of my life locked in a state-run medical facility simply so her ungrateful daughter could buy another imported luxury car. Diane wanted me to be happy. She wanted me to live a life of dignity and complete peace. And for the very first time since she passed away, I was finally going to honor her true wishes. I did not wait for Vanessa to respond. I did not want to hear her weak apologies or her desperate, empty promises. They had both proven exactly who they were, and I was completely finished trying to save them from themselves. I turned my back on the massive conference table and walked slowly out of the dark walnut boardroom. I pushed open the heavy frosted glass doors and stepped into the brightly lit hallway. I walked straight to the private elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. As the steel doors smoothly slid completely shut, blocking my view of Mitchell's office forever, I felt an incredible physical sensation wash over my entire body. It was as if a massive, suffocating weight had been surgically removed from my chest. I rode the elevator down 42 floors and walked out into the busy downtown lobby. The world outside the glass skyscraper was moving rapidly. People were rushing to work holding their hot coffee cups, completely unaware of the absolute devastation that had just occurred upstairs. I stepped out onto the wide city sidewalk and hailed a passing black cab. I did not tell the driver to take me back to my empty temporary hotel room. I gave him the address for the international airport. When I arrived at the massive glass terminal, I walked straight past the chaotic economy check-in counters and approached the quiet premium lounge. I handed the polite attendant my black leather passport and my confirmed first-class ticket. I was not running away from my problems. I was finally walking toward my actual life. For 30 years, Diane and I had dreamed of taking a long, romantic trip to the remote highlands of Scotland. We used to look at glossy travel magazines and talk about renting a small stone cottage near the deep blue lochs. But we always postponed the trip. We always told each other we needed to stay home and save more money just in case Vanessa had another financial emergency. We sacrificed our own precious time to fund her endless, reckless mistakes. I sat in the luxurious leather seat of the airport lounge drinking a cup of hot black tea and looking out the massive window at the planes taking off into the clear blue sky. I was traveling alone, but I did not feel lonely. I carried Diane's beautiful memory securely in my heart, knowing she would be incredibly proud of the strength I had finally found. When the boarding call echoed through the quiet speaker, I gathered my small travel bag and walked down the carpeted bridge onto the massive airplane. I settled into my spacious seat and looked out the small oval window as the powerful jet engines roared to life. The plane accelerated down the long concrete runway and lifted smoothly into the air, leaving the heavy gravity of the city completely behind. I watched the sprawling neighborhoods and the tiny identical houses shrink until they disappeared, entirely hidden beneath a thick blanket of soft white clouds. I was 70 years old, and I had just completely dismantled my entire past to protect my own future. Some people might call my actions ruthless, but sometimes you have to burn down a toxic house to finally see the open sky. I leaned back into my seat, closed my eyes, and smiled. I was finally completely free, and the rest of my life was just beginning. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that unconditional love should never mean unconditional compliance. We often tolerate toxic behavior from our family members because we believe that blood ties require infinite patience and endless financial sacrifice. But true family is built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine care, not manipulation and entitlement. When you allow people to treat you like a disposable resource, you are not helping them grow, you are simply funding their absolute arrogance. Walking away from those who only value what you can provide is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation and self-respect. If you have ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your own peace, please share your story in the comments below and subscribe to the channel for more life lessons.